Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Cannon, and for the Institute for Humane Studies, I'd like to welcome you back to our second lecture with Professor Brandon Turner in this series on liberalism and illiberalisms. The title of this talk is Left Illiberalisms, Marx and Socialism. Professor Turner?
All right. Thanks to Jason and to Emily and the rest of the IHS crew for having me back for a second round. I'm broadcasting to you from a very sad looking closet-like area, but we're headed out of the closet, outwards into the ether and into some heady intellectual space. And we have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in. So on the one hand, the lecture is titled Marx into Liberalism. As I put it together, though, I found that I ended up talking about everything but Marx is putting it too strongly, but I ended up talking a lot about liberalism, and in particular about how I want to look at Marx and how I want to encourage students of liberalism, or just liberals in general, to look at Marx, and in particular the way that Marxist thought leads in some sense out of liberalism, through liberalism, and into something like illiberalism. And so I want to place Marx within a particular context. I mean, there's a tendency to regard Marx as something alien, as something standing outside the liberal tradition. So on the one hand, this is probably an artifact of Marx's style. So Marx writes, one might say, like a German. In particular, he writes like a German coming out of a particular tradition, the dialectical or Hegelian tradition of the early 19th century. And so he doesn't read like Hume or Smith or Locke or whomever. And on top of that, I mean, his ideas, when we think about Marx, we think about someone who stands utterly opposed to the liberal tradition. We think of someone who stands in some sense as the opposite or the inverse, or the great and steady enemy of the liberal tradition. In fact, actually, I mean, if you go online and you spend a lot of time poking around certain corners of YouTube, you'll see a lot of people talking about defending the Western tradition, the Western liberal tradition, and they'll often, pitch it as a kind of defending the Western tradition against people like Marx, which is, at some level sort of crazy, because when we're talking about the Western tradition, we're talking about Marx, right? Marx stands in some sense at a kind of nexus of many ideas and principles and themes and ways of thinking that are, characteristically Western. So I want to move away from thinking about Marx as being in some sense this alien, this enemy of the West. And I want to start thinking about how liberal commitments might lead someone to adopt Marxist positions, or at least to look more sympathetically at Marx and at Marxism. Now, I don't want to confuse anyone, and I want to be perfectly clear. Marx was no liberal, and his thought leads, I think, inexorably to something very much outside of liberalism, to illiberalism. But I want us to remember that liberalism is only one political theory that's available to us in the West, and there's no reason to think it will always win. So reading Marx is useful not only in a kind of know thy enemy sense, which it is. I think that there are very few things that liberals, so-called defenders of liberalism, I think there are very few things they can do more useful than familiarizing themselves with Marx, understanding how his thought operates, understanding where it leaves liberal tradition, where it becomes something illiberal, and how it becomes something illiberal. So on the one hand, there is this sort of know thy enemy sense in which we want to have some familiarity with Locke. But it's also useful because we can use Marx as a way of tracking various strands within liberalism. And we can use Marx to think about when these tensions within the liberal tradition, or in some cases, in the ways that these tensions are overcome, can lead out of the liberal tradition and into something that stands opposed to liberalism, however we understand it. So just as a quick reminder, just to sort of recap what we talked about last time, we're going to go with something like liberalism as the political ideology that emphasizes individual rights and limited government. And I'm using the phrase individual rights there in a relatively expansive sense. It doesn't have to be a kind of pure rights theory, just the idea that the individual is in some sense morally primary. Or to put this in another way, to put this in the phrasing of the French 19th century liberal Benjamin Constant, we can think of liberalism as the enjoyment of security and private pleasures, right? We can call liberty the guarantees accorded by institutions to these pleasures. All right, so that's our definition of liberalism. And what we talked about last time was the way that liberalism represents an answer to a series of questions, right? So we normally think about liberalism as being, like, particularly the sort of natural rights liberalism, the top-down rationalist liberalism of the contractarian tradition of figures like Locke, right? That's a liberalism that represents an answer to the question, what is the proper grounding of authority, right? That's a particular question that liberals answer in a particular way. But we said there were other ways of thinking about liberalism, right? There were other questions that liberalism represents an answer to. And the two that I want to focus on in this talk and in the next couple talks were the second form, right? Liberalism as a form of politics, right? Or what we might think of as political liberalism, not in the Rawlsian sense, but liberalism understood as a series of institutional answers to questions. And then the fourth sense that we talked about, which is liberalism as a form of association. All right, so what is liberalism? Liberalism is that form of association in which we relate to each other not as as a cohort, right? Not as all of us, we don't regard each other as all of us engaged in some common project, but rather, right, it's a form of association where we adopt rules that allow us to all pursue our own individual project, right? So liberalism as association, liberalism as a theory of politics, that's the forms of liberalism that I'm looking at today, or that I'm using today to think about Marx and his relationship to the liberal tradition. Within these, however, within these definitions of liberalism, within these liberalism as an answer sort of definitions of liberalism, there are a number of interlocking parts, right? Ideas and concepts, principles, what we might today refer to as values that are recognizably liberal. And so actually what I want to do is I want to zoom in on one value in particular, or one theme in particular. And oddly enough, I'm actually going to begin to look at this value or this theme. I'm going to begin at Locke. And I'm going to be clear, what I'm doing here is not using Locke as a sort of starting point in a history of ideas with an emphasis on history, right? I'm not sketching out, in other words, a theory of historical influence, but I want to use Locke as a starting point for our own thinking about the relationship between liberty and obligation. Okay, so this is a passage, and I realize there's a lot of text here, but it only took a second to get through. This is a passage from paragraph 6 in chapter 2 of Locke's second treatise from 1690. And what I want to get out of this is, well, let's read it first and I'll tell you what I want to get out of this. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. For men being all the workmanship of one maker, they are his property, i.e. the property of that maker, and therefore there cannot be supposed any such subordination among us that may authorize us to destroy one another as if we were made for one another's uses, as the inferior ranks of creatures are for ours. Everyone, as he is bound to preserve himself and not to quit his station willfully, so by the like reason, when his own preservation comes not in competition, ought he, as much as he can, to preserve the rest of mankind, and may not, unless it be to do justice on an offender, take away or impair the life, or what tends to the preservation of the life, the liberty, health, limb, or goods of another. So we have here, this is a relatively well-known, or a nice encapsulation of various liberal principles. So we have the idea of natural equality. We have the idea of a law of nature, which obligates us not to harm one another. We have here a version of what libertarians might recognize as the NAP, or the non-aggression principle. Right, so, this paragraph, in other words, looks like a sort of textbook definition of a liberal theory of natural rights, right? Natural rights liberalism. And actually, there's a sense in which this is the textbook version of natural rights liberalism. Right? Something like our conception of natural liberty is contained in this passage. Right? At the same time, there's something else in here. And it's something that I want to distinguish from our normal conception or our given conceptions of liberty. Within this passage, there is not only something like a conception of individual liberty, right? Individual liberty rooted in natural rights, themselves rooted in man's nature as a product of his creator. There is over and above this individual liberty, something like what we can call liberation, right? Liberation, the idea that we are obligated on a number of fronts. So even obligated on a number of fronts to not just respect the liberty of others, but to, in some cases, liberate them. On the one hand, we have already in this paragraph, we have a clear obligation right, from God, right? We are the property of God, and we, as a result of this, we cannot allow ourselves to be killed, right? So he mentions 3 times in this paragraph that we are, that we have an obligation to preserve ourselves, that we have an obligation not to, what he says, quit our station willfully, right, to kill ourselves. Right, we, in other words, have a natural obligation to defend ourselves from those who would violate our rights. So again, this is a fairly standard liberal idea, the idea that we have a natural right of self-defense. Okay. At the same time, note these last lines. To preserve, so when his own preservation comes not in competition, ought he, as much as he can, to preserve the rest of mankind, and may not, unless it be to do justice on an offender, take away or impair the life of what tends to the preservation of the life, liberty, health, limb, and goods of another. And I want to focus here on this obligation that we have, not just to preserve ourselves, but to preserve mankind in general. And in fact, in the rest of the second treatise, Locke treats this second obligation, the obligation to preserve mankind, as our primary obligation. He calls this the fundamental law of nature. And in fact, we're obligated to preserve ourselves only insofar as, in doing so, we preserve mankind in general. And in fact, all of the so-called natural rights that we find in Locke, the natural right to private property, for example, right? All of these are in some sense generated by this obligation we have to preserve mankind more generally. If we look at the next paragraph, we read the following. And that all men may be restrained from invading others' rights and from doing hurt to one another, and the law of nature be observed, which willeth the peace and preservation of all mankind. The execution of the law of nature is, in that state, put into every man's hands. This Locke sometimes refers to as his peculiar doctrine, this idea that the execution of the law of nature is, in the natural state, put into every man's hands, whereby everyone has a right to punish the transgressors of that law to such a degree as may hinder its violation. For the law of nature would, as all other laws that concern men in this world, would be in vain if there were no body that in the state of nature had the power to execute that law, and thereby preserve the innocent and restrain offenders. And if anyone in the state of nature may punish another for any evil he has done, everyone may do so. For in that state of perfect equality, where naturally there is no superiority or jurisdiction of one over another, what any may do in prosecution of that law, everyone must needs have a right to do. Right? So because we're obligated to preserve mankind, right, we are thereby given the right, the natural right, to execute the law of nature. Right? The preservation of mankind requires that the law of nature be realized, and the law of nature being realized requires that each and every one of us take upon ourselves the obligation to enforce the law of nature. And note these last lines. This obligation extends to everyone. And it extends to seemingly all violations of the law of nature. Right? Yes, I'm obligated to preserve myself against those who would attempt to put me under their power, right? Those who would attempt to make war on me, to attempt to enslave me. But it seems that I also have apparently an equally strong obligation to resist, i.e. to object violently to the violation of anyone else's rights. Right? Everyone's rights must be protected. And on top of that, I have, to the extent that I have a natural obligation to preserve mankind more generally, I have at the same time an obligation to enforce the laws of nature. Meaning I have an obligation to enforce the right of nature on anyone who would violate it. Now, right, those of you who have read Locke know that, you know, in Locke's political theory, we give up entirely this executive right of nature when we enter into political society, but we always have it as a background condition. right? If it's the political society itself that violates our rights, right, we're immediately thrust back into a state of nature. If we find ourselves in a situation where we can't avail ourselves of the agents of government, right? So if we're being, if we're out in the woods and we're being mugged or something like that, and there aren't any cops around, well, in that case, we again fall back to the state of nature. So even though we give up entirely this right of punishing those who violate the law of nature, right, it's always there in the background. I want to stop sharing. Okay, I successfully stopped the share. So this is not just, in other words, this is not just a defense of, or the grounding of our notions of self-defense, of the non-aggression principle, right? This view that we're obligated to resist those who violate the laws of nature, that we're obligated to resist not only when we ourselves are wronged, but when we are, say, as representatives of a class are wronged, or even when someone else is wronged, right? This is a new thing. And this is, I think, separate from just some concept of liberty, of individual liberty. This thing, this extra obligation, is what we can call liberation. And it's surprising, actually, how distinctly modern the idea of liberation is. And when I say modern, I mean, right, if we compare the idea of liberation to medieval ideas or Christian ideas about, on the one hand, right, pure obedience to the powers that be, right? So if you read, a given 12th or 13th century text, you're likely to encounter either the view that we have as an obligation to God, we have an obligation to be completely and utterly obedient to those with political authority, or at most, we have something like an obligation to passively resist, right? So, we don't ourselves have to commit any injustices, right, if commanded to do so by the state, but at the same time, we can't actually resist them. We can't violently resist attempts to make us do injustice. But liberation is exactly that, right? We have an obligation to violently resist those who commit injustice. And I want to be clear, while we looked at Locke to sort of find this, there's a sense in which liberation has very much burst the box of, natural jurisprudence or natural rights theory. Very few people alive today have sat down and read the second treatise carefully, or have looked at Pufendorf or any number of these sources. But the idea that we ought to fight injustice is pretty common. And in fact, actually, it's one of the few ideas that seems to be common sort of up and down what we might think of as a kind of ideological hierarchy, right? There's a sense in which most people who know a lot, who pay a lot of attention to politics, see liberation as in some sense the end of politics or the goal of politics. But even at the folk level, right, in terms of the political theory that most people operate according to, even if it just is a kind of background condition, right? Liberation is there too, right? Everyone recognizes that injustice is in some sense bad, that oppression is bad. And everyone recognizes that we, each of us, have, if not the obligation, then at some point the right to do something about it. This is where the entire superhero genre comes from, right? From this longing to see injustice done out above and beyond the normal constraints of due process and procedural norms. But we can trace this idea of liberation throughout what we think of as the primary, the great documents of the liberal tradition. So we see it, for example, and probably most notably in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. And again, I want to be clear, I'm not making any sort of strong empirical claims about the historical influence of Locke on any of these things, but it is nonetheless the case that Jefferson's Declaration stands as something like a statement of not just individual liberty, but of liberation. If we see the way that people reacted to Jefferson's Declaration, we see the very same. So if we look at the French Declaration of the Rights of the Citizen and Man, if we look at, for example, if we look at the Declaration of Sentiments that was produced at the Seneca Falls Conference in 1848, right? This is one of the foundational texts in what we recognize as first wave feminism, right? Written by, at least partly by, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And what does the Declaration of Sentiments do? It takes the Declaration of Independence and it basically swaps in patriarchy for King George, right? The Declaration of Sentiments considers the liberation insights of the Declaration of Independence so obvious and so uniformly received that all they needed to do was just take out the bits about English tyranny and put in bits about patriarchal tyranny. If we look at, for example, the work of Frederick Douglass, and we look at the ideas that motivated many abolitionists, we see the same basic idea, right? When Frederick Douglass was reacting to fugitive slave laws, et cetera, one of his primary moves was to switch to a kind of natural rights jurisprudential lens. What is someone who enforces the fugitive slave laws? It's a kidnapper. Is it just to kill a kidnapper? Yes. Are we obliged? Are we obligated to kill a kidnapper? Probably. If we look at somebody like John Brown, right? John Brown as, in some sense, the ultimate example of someone motivated by the desire to liberate others. We see the same basic idea, right? Brown, who argued that the state of slavery is a state of war. Brown, who in his provisional constitution for a new Appalachian free state, he actually required or encouraged everyone to go around with arms, with guns. Why? Because at any given moment, we may be required to liberate ourselves and liberate others from oppression or from those who would attempt to put them under their power. So we might say that within liberalism, I mean, we not just might say this, I am saying this, within liberalism runs these paired ideas that arbitrary power, right, understood as power which is in itself not justified, power which is a function of the will of the person exercising the power rather than as the will of the person over whom the power is being exercised. Arbitrary power is either, so within liberalism, we say that arbitrary power is either completely irredeemable, or at the very least, it's regarded with extreme skepticism, right? Any situation in which arbitrary power is being exercised has a very high threshold of justification to meet. Right? So that's one thing within the liberal tradition. And paired with this is the view that a liberal politics, and this can be undertaken at the level of the state, which it often is, but this can also be undertaken at the level of associations, and it can be undertaken at the level of individuals, right? I'm arguing that John Brown, in something like the raid on Harper's Ferry, was engaged in liberal politics, okay? So a liberal politics undertaken at whatever level contains within it the obligation to minimize exposure to arbitrary power, right? So it's not just the skepticism about arbitrary power, but it's on top of this, the idea that our politics ought to be motivated by the minimization of this power. On the last session, sort of following what might be called political libertarians like Jacob Levy and others, I distinguish between liberalism as a theory of authority and liberalism as a theory of politics. But I don't want us to leave this question of liberation at the abstract or at the level of justification of authority, right? I want to sort of take it out of this natural rights discussion and put it into the second discussion, put it into the discussion of liberalism as a form of politics. So if we just look at what liberal politics looks like, we can describe each level of liberal politics as itself predicated on the idea of liberation. So if we look at individual rights, right, or the creation of a so-called private sphere in which we are, in some sense, buffered by private property, right? This is an attempt to liberate us from the potential oppression of those around us and of the state. If we look at the rule of law, if we look at constitutionalism, separation of powers, federalism, all of these examples of liberal political theory, what we see in all of these is an attempt to minimize our exposure to arbitrary power. If we look at liberal appropriation of associational life, right? Associations as buffers against the power of the state, for example. To what extent do associations serve as buffers against the state? To the extent that they minimize our exposure to the arbitrary power of the state. Now, these four things, individual rights, rule of law, constitutionalism, understood as separation of powers, federalism, associational life, this is, in some sense, the traditional batch of classical liberalism political theory. But we can add to this a number of other spaces within liberal politics that we more commonly associate with the left. So in particular, if we think about democratic politics, if we think about democracy itself as an attempt to minimize exposure to arbitrary power, whether that arbitrary power be exercised by the state or by private actors, by corporations, right? There's a sense in which, for many democratic theorists, for many within the liberal tradition, many like Benjamin Constant and other 19th century French thinkers, right? There's a deliberate move, right? Instead of a gun on every hip, a la John Brown, right? We might have a ballot in every hand. Democratic politics within the liberal tradition understood as a strategy or a tactic to minimize the individual's exposure to arbitrary power. Related to this, and perhaps more recently, we can look at work done on workplace democracy. So in particular, I have Elizabeth Anderson in mind, but Abe Singer's new book on this is also great, right? Many liberals argue that the state is not the only site, or the state and our neighbors are not the only threats, right? They're not the only people who can exercise arbitrary power. But the sort of power that's exercised in the workplace is of such a character, is of such a nature, that it should also trigger our liberal rejection of arbitrary politics. And that to think about workplace democracy, or to think about the workplace as a site of arbitrary power, is to not abandon our liberal principles, but rather to apply liberal principles, to apply a liberal politics to spaces in which they otherwise aren't used to being applied. Right, so liberal politics, like the second form of liberalism, it's guided by this presumption of not just liberty, but of the obligation to liberate. Right, and it recognizes at a fundamental level that no equilibrium of power is permanent, and that liberty and liberation are won only through political vigilance. Right, so in other words, this is, I think, the good form of liberation within the liberal tradition. But not all theories of liberation are created equal. Right, and there are two in particular that I want to look at. And the first is Rousseau on liberation. So for those of you familiar with Rousseau, I understand that Jason has recently spent some time with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It can be a trying experience, particularly for those committed to something like liberalism. Rousseau can be a nice hate read. If we read Rousseau as a theorist of liberation, and I think that's one of the most obvious ways to read him, right? We can chart in some sense his course over the ways in which he considered liberation. If we look at the second discourse, for example, right, what is the second half of the second discourse? The second half where he describes our move out of nature and into right, a sort of primitive state of coexistence, but then our decline from this otherwise harmonious form of association with one another, our decline into something like the modern nation state. For Rousseau, of course, it's agriculture and metallurgy, which lead to large-scale adoption of private property, and at some point codependence, right? It's relations of wage labor and dependence on one another that lead us out of a state of happy independence and into a state of something like enslavement, right? Enslavement to one another, enslavement of the have-nots to the haves. We can look too at the social contract, right? Rousseau's next major work, for his articulation of the problem of liberation. And we can see how in the social contract, liberation for Rousseau, there's a sense in which Rousseau wants to liberate us down to our toes, right? Liberation goes in some sense much deeper for Rousseau than it did for figures like Locke, figures like John Brown, who sought to liberate us from arbitrary power, but who at some point stopped there. They stopped at the limiting of arbitrary power. So I'm actually going to share my screen again. I assume you guys can see that. This is the way that Rousseau in chapter 6 of the Social Contract describes the modern predicament, the predicament of liberation in the world of commercial states. He puts it this way, right? What is the social contract, or what question does the social contract answer? It answers the following question: to find a form of association that will bring the whole common force to bear on defending and protecting each associate's person and goods, doing this in such a way that each of them, while uniting himself with all, still obeys only himself and remains as free as before, right? It's this last bit that is, that's of most concern to us here, right? How is it that we can enter into a nation state? How is it that we can enter into a society in which we will be told what to do, right? We'll be united with others. We will no longer be perfectly independent. We'll no longer be our own authentic masters. How could we do that while still obeying only ourselves and thereby remain as free as before? And of course, his answer very famously is this: that each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will. And in our corporate capacity, we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. Which is to say that for Rousseau, ultimately what has to be overcome is the conflict between our own individual wills and the will of those in authority, or the will of the community. And how is this project undertaken? Well, for Rousseau, it's undertaken by a kind of whole-scale reformation of each and every one of us. Right? For him, the model is something like Sparta, a society in which individuals, right, at least in Rousseau's framing, individuals were able to quiet or to mollify their individual wills. They were able to essentially negate that voice that came within, for which they identified as just themselves, as particular individuals. And in its place, right, they were able to replace this individual will with something like a communal will, or what Rousseau calls the general will. Right? We have to undertake, in other words, a project of wholesale reformation within ourselves. But again, the issue here is that for Rousseau, the thing that we have to be liberated from isn't readily identifiable, right? It isn't some object out there. It isn't some oppressor. The thing that we have to be liberated from is within us, right? It is our own particularity. It's the clash between our own particular will and the forces of the powers that be around us, right? It's the clash between these things that leads to a state of unfreedom. What does it mean to be unfree? It means to do things, right? To be forced to do things that you do not, in some sense, own, that you do not, in some sense, identify with. So how does Rousseau overcome this? Well, because the common direction of the state's force is necessary, it's ourselves that must change, right? We ourselves need to conform ourselves to this thing, the general will. It's here, I think, that we can jump to Marx. Now, there are many features of Marx's thought that put people off, but much of the stuff that gets brought up is actually pretty recognizable. And it's not just recognizable, it's actually stuff that he borrows from the liberal tradition. So his theory of history, for example, or his theory of dialectical materialism. I mean, the theory that we can pull out of, the Manifesto, for example, or a number of other sources in which he discusses his dialectical approach to history, it isn't all that different from the views of history that we find in, say, Hume, but especially the views of history that we find in Book 3 of Smith's Wealth of Nations. Right? There's, a materialist or evolutionary approach to the development of institutions, right, in the interaction between commercial activity and the development of political institutions. In the West is, by the time Marx is writing in the 19th century, pretty well-trod ground. Not just well-trod ground, well-trod by liberals, by those that we place in the liberal tradition. His ideas about, the deleterious effects of the division of labor on the working class, these aren't alien to the tradition either. Usually when I do, an IHS talk on Marx, I'll bring up one of these long quotations from Book 5 of the Wealth of Nations, where Smith is, bemoaning the fate of the working classes, right? The effect of the division of labor on the average person. If we think about the pin factory from Smith, right? Before we might have been the pin guy in town, we might have, in being the pin maker, we did the deliveries, we were part of the community, we kept the books, so we kept our minds sharp. We bought and sold the materials, so we were sort of engaged in market interactions. In other words, making pins, being a pin maker was, you might say, a more comprehensive endeavor than what it is by the end of Smith's example. By the end, we're just the guy that pulls the string, or just the guy that taps on the head, or just the guy that does delivery, and we're doing this kind of machine-like task. So the idea that the division of labor, that capitalism understood as increased and increasingly sophisticated specialization in the labor market, the idea that this would have a negative effect on the individuals who participated in it, that isn't original to Marx. He pulls that directly out of Smith. Now, Smith's answer, of course, is education. Marx's answer is altogether different. So again, the things that usually get cited, the historical stuff, the stuff on the working class, all of this stuff is perfectly at home within the liberal tradition. Not only that, but the concern for the working classes, right? The concern for the effects of the institutions that we now think of as capitalism, that is itself at home within the liberal tradition, right? There's no reason to think that there isn't space within liberalism for concern about the working poor. So what is alien to the liberal tradition in Marx? Well, what's alien within the liberal tradition in Marx is itself the concept of alienation, right? So for those of you who are familiar with Marx, right, you've probably read the 1844 manuscripts, the economic and philosophical manuscripts. You're probably familiar with his essay on estranged labor, right? So in the essay on estranged labor, Marx argues that within the system of classical political economy, workers are, and not just workers, right, anyone engaged in the capitalist mode of production, they're alienated from the world around them, right? They're alienated from the objects of their labor, right? So when they work, the thing that they make is not theirs, right? It belongs to the boss. It's something that confronts them as alien, right? In other words, the kind of essential connection between someone who is engaged in a creative endeavor and the thing that they make, this connection is severed. Right? So that's one form of alienation. In being alienated from the object of our labor, we're simultaneously alienated from the laboring process in general, right? Work becomes this thing to be dreaded, right? Work becomes the place where we aren't at home. Work becomes the place where we have, the sort of thing that we have to drudge through in order to get to our home life, right? There's a reason why people say, TGIF or whatever, and it's because work sucks. And work sucks, Marx thinks, because we're alienated from the work that we do, right? The things that we do aren't things that we think are important to us. They're things that we're told to do. They're things that we're told to do in order for us to receive a wage. In being alienated from the object of our labor and in being alienated from laboring itself, we're simultaneously alienated from what it means to be human, right? What is the human being? What is what Marx calls the species being of this thing called human? It is to work with the world around us. It is to engage in creative endeavors with what Marx calls our inorganic body, right? It is to essentially produce products, useful things out of the earth. And because working, which is to say, being human in this creative sense, because working is something we're alienated from, we're simultaneously alienated from what it means to be human. And then finally, of course, we're alienated. In being alienated from all these sorts of things, we're being alienated from one from another. Right? We're not at home with the people around us. If we're a worker, right, we hate the workers around us, right? When they work harder, it means we have to work harder. We hate, immigrants into our community. Why? Because every unskilled laborer just reduces our wages. And of course, we also hate our bosses and we hate management. We hate all these people because they are working according to a logic that is essentially hostile to our interests, and vice versa, right? Management hates the workers, and they hate other managers. Capitalists hate everyone. I mean, we're all basically stuck in this sort of dog-eat-dog world. And so we are therefore alienated one from another. So we're alienated from work, we're alienated from what it means to be human, we're alienated from each other. And as a result of this, we can't be, and to be clear, we can never be, for Marx, at home. We can never be settled in this world. For Marx, as to some extent for Rousseau, the enemy to be combated is itself within us. Right? So Marx distinguishes between what we sometimes refer to as the base and what is referred to as the superstructure. So the base is the current state of the means of production. Right? The base will necessitate the creation of a class structure, and our ideas about the world will be in some sense generated by our position within that class structure, which is simply to say that for Marx, our consciousness will always be itself a product of the material circumstances that we find ourselves in, which means that right, capitalism or liberal commercial society, whatever you want to call it, the state of the world we're in now will never be at home here, because as long as the material conditions remain unchanged, right, as long as they remain the same, our consciousness will remain in some sense in a permanently alienated state. Right? Material precedes consciousness, and what he means by that is just this. Right? No amount of reform within the system is going to liberate us from this false consciousness. No amount of raising the wages of workers, no amount of making bosses friendlier to workers, no amount of corporate logos telling funny jokes on Twitter is going to in any way, shape, or form change the fundamental fact of capitalism, of this particular mode of production, and of the false consciousness that it produces. So this makes Marx hostile to liberalism, and in particular, it makes Marx hostile to liberalism in the two ways that we've been discussing. Marx is hostile to liberal politics, and he was hostile to liberal politics. He's hostile not only in the sense that he wasn't a rights theorist, right? When Marx isn't a rights theorist, but he's openly hostile to rights, right? His early essay on the Jewish question is a nice place to start with Marx's rejection, not only of individual rights, but of liberal politics altogether, right? All liberal politics does when it liberates us from arbitrary power, whether it does so through individual rights, whether it does so through constitutional reforms, all it does is it further enslaves us by liberating us into ever more capitalist relations of production. By making us freer to work and to trade and to live as private individuals, which is what a liberal politics tries to do, in liberating us in this way, buttressed on all sides by private property and individual rights and political institutions, I mean, all it really does is free us to be slaves, right? This is the freedom of a slave. This is the freedom of someone who exists in a state of false consciousness, in a state of alienation from the world around them. True liberation comes not from political reform, not from the adoption of more individual rights. True liberation comes from within. Right? Consciousness is the proper footing, or setting consciousness on the proper footing is the primary project of Marxist reform. So, in other words, when does liberalism or liberation, when does it move out of liberalism or liberal theory or liberal politics and become something like illiberalism? And we're looking left here. Well, it does it when it ceases to take people as they are. Right? Liberalism as a mode of association refers to the terms of association through which intelligent people pursuing their own ends can live together peaceably. But this form of association must assume as a background condition that those around us are, in fact, intelligent people, which is to say that those around us are agents, responsible and capable of pursuing their own ends, of deciding their own fates. Right? Liberalism as an association and liberalism as politics takes people as they are in the sense that it leaves to the side, in fact, it brackets entirely questions that might be called questions of existential, spiritual, or moral health. Right? Marx ultimately becomes illiberal because he's a theorist of what we discussed last time in the language of Michael Oakeshott. Marx is a theorist of universitas, not societas. Right? He sees the proper footing of consciousness being in a state of universal brotherhood. Right now, we are disassociated individuals pursuing our own ends, and Marx sees that as the problem. Right? We'll stop pursuing our own ends in our own private ways once we realize that mankind is one family, right? One universal brotherhood. Right? To follow Marx in this sense is to overturn civil association altogether. I think actually it's 11:45. I'll stop there and turn things over to questions. I hope that was sufficiently clear. Do you guys have questions?
Thank you. Yeah, we have several questions. So a very provocative and interesting talk. Thank you. So first, how is the idea of liberal politics as resistance to arbitrary power to be distinguished from Republican, small r Republican, notions of non-domination?
So I'll be perfectly honest, I don't think there's a whole lot to that distinction. I don't think the neo-Republican, the Pettit and Skinner project was a waste. I think it actually was useful on a number of levels, but ultimately, right? Pettit claims Locke as a Republican. Pettit claims Sidney as a Republican. Pettit claims any number of figures that we place in the liberal tradition as Republicans, with the exception of Hobbes and Dudley Digges and Jeremy Bentham, William Paley. These are minor figures, and these are nobody's ideas of liberalism. I don't think there's a whole lot to that distinction, the distinction between liberalism conceived in this way and republicanism. I think basically what Pettit is doing there is correcting a mistake that was made in the Berlinian decision to, completely and utterly separate negative from positive liberty. Liberal republicanism is a thing, and actually, I would argue. I would think that most of the figures that we place in the thing called liberal tradition, most of the figures that we use when we think as liberals, would qualify as, in some sense, both liberals and Republicans.
So you mentioned that John Brown was in some sense working within liberal politics. Could you elaborate on that in the sense that this seems like a case where liberalism and liberation might come apart, in that there were other avenues to hold accountable those who Brown thought were perpetuating the injustice. So when you lose something like the rule of law in those situations and violence becomes the recourse, how does that square with the liberal frame?
So, I mean, again, I mean, liberalism is not just a spectrum, but it's any number of spectrums. John Brown obviously fits in at the more radical end of any number of spectrums. But I mean, what Brown did, and I should be clear, I think Brown's primary motivations were not something called liberalism. I think his primary motivation was Christianity, but I want to set that to the side for a second. Nonetheless, there's nothing that Brown did that wouldn't be, perfectly justified by the doctrine that we find in Locke's second treatise and a number of other treatises. I mean, there's a sense in which what Brown was confronted with was, straightforwardly, it was a system of systematic injustice. And I don't mean that in the sort of contemporary sense in which, outcomes that are and I don't mean that in the sense of like systemic racism, which is real, and we can talk about that. This wasn't systemic racism. This was, in some sense, violence committed on an enormous scale every single day on millions of people. So I think what Brown did was, in fact, a kind of liberal politics, right? He wanted to liberate an enslaved people, and the language that he used to describe this process of liberation it's a language that seems at home within the liberal tradition. I mean, again, the fact that he actually had a provisional constitution. I mean, he saw himself as participating in something that might be described as liberal constitutionalism. Much of that document is, very recognizable as, so somewhat commonplace ideas about liberal institutions. So, yeah, I mean, the fact that he not only did he plan to liberate them, to run across the South and incite these slave revolts, but then he wanted to bring them into a form of liberal association with the Constitution and with a liberal institutional framework. So, yeah, I do think that was an example of liberal politics.
What do you think explains the hesitancy, and we might even call it an aversion to democracy as a check against arbitrary power among some liberals? And by this, we might mean arbitrary power in law or in the workplace, as you mentioned.
Sure. I mean, I want to be clear. I think that liberals have plenty of reasons to be skeptical of democracy. I think there is a tendency in certain corners of what we now describe as the left. There's a tendency to use democracy as something like a magic word, right? Democratic refers to anything that's good. I mean, how do we want decisions made? Well, we want them to be made as democratically as possible, even within some forms of association where we have no reason to think that democratic decision making applies. Not only that, but I mean, historically, if we look at the sort of 19th century of romantic democratic theory, or the democratic theory, that is in some sense premised on the idea of a people, which of course is tied up with all sorts of ethnic nationalism and all this kind of thing. I think as liberals, we have plenty of reasons to be skeptical of certain forms of democracy. And I think, so in other words, I think people who are skeptical of democracy have plenty of good reasons to be skeptical of democracy, but I think that sometimes those who describe themselves as classical liberal or libertarians tend to go overboard, right? So, somebody like Mencken, who's popular in a number of classical liberal libertarian circles, clearly goes completely and totally overboard. Mencken is not, Mencken is is an op-ed columnist who's often misunderstood as some kind of philosopher or democratic theorist, but he's not. It doesn't take any special powers of insight to recognize that most people aren't particularly bright. It doesn't take special powers of insight to recognize that most people aren't particularly well informed about politics. At the same time, right? Most people are relatively good judges of which institutions work for them, of which parties have their interests in mind. And I think that as liberals, we need to recognize that historically speaking, democratic politics have been, historically speaking, a way of increasing individual liberty in a number of spheres. As for the workplace thing, I mean, I think the workplace thing is another space in which the language of contract tends to crowd out all other liberal concerns. So in other words, how do we think about workplace democracy or power within the workplace? I mean, there is something to be said. I think there's a lot actually to be said of always keeping in mind that workplaces are voluntary associations, right? That when I go to work, I'm choosing to do so, that I've chosen to work at this particular job. I've chosen this association to work for, and vice versa, right? The association has chosen me. I mean, I think that's important to keep in mind. At the same time, right, we might want to be more cognizant of the fact that these decisions are always made against certain background conditions, right? That if my choices are work for some horrible boss or starve, I'm not saying that we ought to, that the starving part of it takes any kind of absolute precedence over the voluntary part of it, but these are considerations to keep in mind. And we also might further be more open as an empirical matter to the best place to organize a workplace, or sorry, the best way to organize a workplace.
Both Smith and Mill raised concerns that certain working conditions were actively undermining the ability of citizens to function as educated, free, liberal citizens. And Mill eventually moved toward worker co-ops as a possible means for preserving certain freedoms. Are there strands of liberalism currently or after those thinkers that preserve that attention to detrimental economic conditions?
Yeah, I mean, yes, and they're all over. So on the one hand, you have, I mean, I would say those we normally think of as being on the left are very sensitive to these sorts of issues. The C4SS guys, the mutualists, I mean, these guys are drawing explicitly on Marx. So I mean, they're obviously, I think, very much in tune with the danger of power exercise and the labor market and all those kinds of things. Ultimately, I don't know. I mean, ultimately, I think it's an empirical question, right? So even if we recognize that within the liberal tradition, we have this sometimes quite expansive concern for the plight of the working classes, I think that there is an empirical question on how that plight is addressed. And I think that there's room for a diversity of views on this particular question. It might be the case that what we need is a universal basic income, right? I mean, the UBI is often touted, often among quite libertarian, in quite libertarian spaces, as a way to sort of short circuit some of the power relations that dominate employment markets. Then again, I mean, maybe it's the case that a more sort of brutalist approach is necessary, where what's really happened is that we've had we've had people put into a position of dependence on the welfare state, and that they need to be re-entered or moved back into basically some combination of self-reliance and mutual aid societies or something like that. I mean, I think there's a room for a diversity of views on this. I think largely it's an empirical question, or at least our views ought to turn on certain empirical questions. But I think there's plenty of room within the liberal tradition for disagreement on not only the extent to which commercial society has these effects, but what the proper remedy is. I think, again, where Marx pushes beyond the liberal tradition is in thinking that what has to be abandoned is, commercial liberalism altogether. That the rot, so to speak, is so deep within us that, whole-scale re-education, reformation of the individual is what's needed. That, I think, pushes us into something completely different.
How does taking people as they are relate to liberal critiques of wrong values such as patriarchy or racism or homophobia?
Right. So, I mean, again, lots of interesting questions here. So for example, I think what we've learned over the past 40 or 50 years is that, for example, racist attitudes, and moreover, not just racist attitudes, but racist outcomes, which are themselves the product not of explicitly racial attitudes or racist attitudes, but are actually the product of what we might recognize as spontaneous order, right? That racialized attitudes and racist outcomes are, they seem to be quite pugnacious in the sense that they don't seem to want to go away. And I think there's been a turn in the last 5 or 10 years with the rise of so-called woke liberalism. I think woke liberalism, while on the one hand, I mean, I think that to be woke is in many cases to simply recognize realities, right? I don't think it takes any great acts of woke imagination to recognize that we have a problem with policing in this country, and that the problem with policing has a racial dimension, right? You can be the most Burkean conservative in the world. In fact, I think the proper Burkean conservative position is that we should be horrified about what's going on with policing in this country, and we should be even more alarmed about its racial dimension. I don't think that requires any sort of great leaps of wokeness. But of course, being woke, I mean, the term woke itself seems to imply a kind of change in consciousness. It seems to imply that we've had a kind of road to Damascus sort of moment where the scales have fallen from our eyes and we now see things differently. This is where I start to get a little nervous. So, for example, something like mandated sensitivity training. This is, I think, a very touchy subject, and I think actually, to be perfectly honest, I think many of the concerns that those who we normally place on the right about these mandated trainings, I think they probably have a pretty good point on this stuff, particularly if employment itself, if not citizenship itself, becomes dependent on going through these sorts of programs. That, I think, this is a legitimate concern. The idea that it's not just enough not to be racist, but that we actually have to go in, as it were, and root out any racist attitudes or racist uses of language and all this kind of stuff. This does somewhat concern me. In fact, the way that wokeness seems to focus almost pathologically on the language that we use, and in many cases on sort of our unconscious reactions to various things, that I think is concerning. I think down that path, illiberalism lies.
We have time for one last question, and this connects back to the earlier question about John Brown. So one might use the sort of logic that you've discussed to justify other sorts of violence and rioting. And this question raises the recent riots in the US surrounding various police brutality cases. So how can we distinguish justified and liberal uses of not just civil disobedience, but actual like civil disorder compared to those that are unjust and illiberal in some sense?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question. And I mean, I only have a minute or two here, so I'll impart more of a spirit of an answer rather than an answer itself. I mean, I think the proper approach is to exercise judgment. I don't think that there is any clear line that we can draw between when a riot is undertaken as a matter of liberal politics and when a riot is just trying to get stuff. I don't think that there's any clear line there. I think there are empirical questions about whether riots are effective or not. And there are questions of justice that have to be sorted out. And I think that at some level, I think each of us has to apply our faculties of judgment to determine what we think the best response is. I will say this, there is a spectrum of views on this within the liberal tradition, right? It's very difficult to look back at the history, at our often very romanticized history of civil disobedience and just uncivil disobedience, I should say, and conclude from that that rioting is never justified. I think there's a lot of pent-up anger about policing, and I think a lot of it is extremely justified, right? I mean, taking a glance at Radley Balco's work on this, it's eye-opening. It's an eye-opening experience. I mean, and everyone interested in liberal politics understood as the deliberate minimization of exposure to arbitrary power should be horrified, should be shocked and appalled at the state of policing right now and the complete and utter lack of accountability. And so I don't think we can just set rioting off the table as a justifiable response. Now, you could look at the rioting going on across the US this summer and say that this rioting, for such and such reasons, is not an expression of liberal politics. But ultimately, that's going to be a matter of gathering evidence and applying judgment. So I don't think that it can be done. I don't think that there's a clear-cut case one way or the other. I don't think that there's a bright line that can be referred to when it comes to what sorts of violence are permitted and what sorts aren't. I think generally liberals ought to prefer ballots to bullets, as the phrasing goes, but it's very difficult to exercise ballot control over police accountability, issues of police accountability. So in other words, one thing we might think about is making police more accountable to traditional means of controlling power.